What's up, everybody? I'm Nick Gaze with Springboard Creative, and welcome to the first episode of SBC Digest. Today, we're going to be tackling the topic of whether or not swimming and diving should be separate sports at the NCAA level. So, let's get into it. Now, we posted some early results from a survey we're doing, and it was very, very mixed reviews, with about a third of people saying yes, a third saying no, and obviously another third saying they don't know. And when we posted it to Facebook, we got great response, everybody weighing in, and there's a lot of emotion around the issue. So what I'm going to try to do is take a look at some of the logistical components and why it may or may not make sense for this to happen, what maybe an administrator might be thinking as we go through this process and into all of the changes that are coming out of the House settlement and those sorts of things. So the first thing we're going to talk about really, as we get into this is what are the main things that are making this an issue? And there's three main components. The first is fear. Everybody's worried about their job right now, particularly in Olympic sports, and whether or not they're going to get to keep it with the money being divvied up to, mainly the revenue programs, football and basketball and such. So that's a big issue right now, and everybody's a little bit nervous. The second is opportunity, and this is a little bit more emotional, but where diving coaches and divers, have always kind of felt like maybe they were limited because of what was going on, and they don't get as many opportunities to do things. And maybe, moving to a condensed roster that's coming up now could impact that even more. So there are some concerns there. And I think the biggest one in the emotional realm is the conflict, right? The conflict between essentially swim coaches who are the heads of programs and diving coaches who are often just considered an assistant on that staff because diving is just considered events in a meet. So, that tension has led to things like roster inequity, whether it's how many divers you take to a conference meet or to a championship, NCAA championships, or even are allowed to have on your roster in general, how much money is allocated via scholarships to them or to go do recruiting, that kind of stuff. Often the head coach will have control over the salaries of the assistants. They get a pool to work with. And so that can mean maybe less benefits, less salary for a diving coach. And priority of training times, depending on how your pool's set up. A lot of times swim says, we're going to take this and you guys get what's left. So there's definitely been some conflict, for a long time in that realm. The other area is, and we've seen this kind of recently, where particularly at some really high-end programs, swim coaches feel like they don't need diving, right? They can win without it. And here's the thing, regardless of whether or not they can or can't, if they believe they can, that's all that matters. And they could just eliminate diving from their rosters and say, hey, we're going to keep just all swimmers right now. And as this roster condenses, we might say there's not enough value for divers. I can take that money, I can invest in more swimmers, I can replace a diving coach with a swim coach, I can manage schedules better, I got more space. When we travel, we don't have to worry about divers competing at different times, etc. So there's a lot of components there that have created conflict between those two groups. And I do want to emphasize too, one thing that I have noted, especially from comments and feedback from athletes and coaches all over, is that this really seems to be much more of a coach issue than an athlete issue, where I think the athletes are okay being on a team together. They have their friends, their roommates, they hang out. It's not nearly as divisive as what we see between the coaches. And part of that is ego at play. Part of that is fear, again, job security, those sort of things, which has driven this emotionally for a long time. Now we're getting to the point where there are some real logistical concerns that could force the hand of some people. So we want to get into that and try to look at this a little bit from a logistical angle. So we're going to kind of break this down into two areas, the case for and the case against. So if we're talking about for, again, we're talking about replacing swimming and why this would make sense. And again, I'm trying to look at this a little bit from an administrator standpoint, because as a coach, you're not going to have that say, right? And it's going to come down to the administrators who are looking at the checkbook basically and saying, what can we logistically make happen? So if you had something where you pulled diving out of swimming and then were thus to eliminate swimming, you're looking at fewer coach salaries, less athletes because your team is going to be smaller, which is also going to mean a smaller budget, right? Less to travel everywhere, less hotel rooms, less on meals, less on apparel, all that stuff. You would need less scholarship dollars to support that team. Little things like suits. And I know that seems like a real inconsequential item, but when a competition racing suit for a swimmer is $300 to $500, and maybe they're getting one or two of those a year, and you do that times 20 versus the cost of a regular suit for a diver, those numbers add up in your budgets when you're really getting down to it. And I think one of the main reasons that this could really become to the forefront is, should the Division I requirements stay in place where we have to have those minimum numbers of sports, you could then have the same number of sports with less athletes to manage and to have to pay for. And I think that's going to be really critical when administrators are looking at the bottom dollar. Second area is elevating programs, and what this does, as a diving coach, you're going to be able to build that roster differently because you're going to have different goals. You can train them differently. You don't have to worry about scheduling based off of dual meets and what the swim coach wants or needs for performance. You can try to maximize where it makes sense. You're going to get the training times that you prefer typically, as opposed to maybe where you're pushed to right now. Again, your goals can shift. It's not just about putting team points up there, but maybe it's about reaching certain levels of scores or something rather than places. And certainly you can prepare better for national and international competitions. And as we get ready to host in 2028 for the Olympics, that's going to matter. But also collectively, we're seeing things like AAU making a bigger push internationally and that sort of stuff. So I think there is going to be a little more to play there. It's not just going to rely on the top 2 or 3 programs that may feel like that matters. So again, autonomy and opportunity. This is something that I mentioned earlier, but feeling like you have some control as a diving coach and as a program where you haven't had that before. So now you're going to get a little more opportunity to have participation from having more athletes available to go to that. We can control the format, and that's one of the things that's been talked about, is making it more viewer friendly. So we can make some changes maybe to the sport and to how it's presented and have control over that. The diving coach is going to have some security because their job will not be controlled by the swim coach or by the swim coach's status. If that swim coach leaves voluntarily or involuntarily, often that puts the diving coach in a lurch and puts them on the block. And this would let them have some of that security of their own there. And it gives them more opportunity for better compensation because now they are elevated to a head coach, and maybe that means they get better chances for bonus, more compensation, better benefits, a little more security, that sort of thing. So certainly there is a reason in that realm why coaches would want it. And I think the last reason here is that we're not the same, right? We've heard that the only thing that is the same is water. Well, in all other locations in the world, diving is a totally separate sport from swimming, right? At the Olympics, they don't compete together. Their points aren't total. There's nothing like that. All international competitions is the same way. Even domestically at the junior and senior levels, when you're looking at AAU or USA Diving, everything is separate. Only in America, in high school and college, is this a combined activity. The other thing, and I heard this brought up recently, and I thought it was a fantastic argument, was that swimming is very objective. It's down to the 100th of a second or 1,000th of a second, depending, and it is or it isn't, right? Where swimming is. Where diving is very subjective. And so then combining points where you have different factors controlling how they get there is a unique situation. And so separating those out kind of does make sense instead of having some subjective point accumulation and objective point accumulation going together. And the other thing is that originally coaches way back when often coached multiple sports. And in fact, they didn't even have to be swimming and diving. You might coach basketball and football and baseball at a school. Arizona State, long time ago, had a famous coach who did all 3 of those for a long time. And a lot of those athletes competed in multiple sports, like you would see at the high school level, but at the college level. And so you're not seeing divers who swim events anymore or vice versa. So the need to have them together is less prevalent than it was back then. Now, we flip this over and we look at the case against. Obviously, we're talking about stuff like, well, this is the sport and you are events. Just like distance or individual medley, you're events in a lineup, and that's how it works. They'll say track and field doesn't split and have field separately. I think the flip of that is internationally, it's always together as well. And that if you're doing this, you're contributing to a larger team goal and you have a different learning experience and social experience from participating in that fashion. Okay. Lack of support. People would say, well, diving doesn't have enough attention to stand on its own, right? It's already a non-revenue sport, and now you're going to reduce those numbers of potential parents or whoever comes to it. If you look at Olympic trials, swimming's got 20, 30,000 at a session. Diving has like 1,000. So obviously those numbers are very different, and that the participation numbers nationally and internationally, swimming is way higher. So there is an argument that says, hey, diving can't support itself without swimming. Could be easier to cut, and this is for either sport, right? If diving does stand alone, it could make it easier to cut swimming then because of the conversation we had earlier. Or it could make diving easier to cut because you say, hey man, there's less athletes, less coaches to impact. We're sort of minimizing the damage if we do that. And again, it doesn't generate revenue, so it is easier to cut when that's the case. Cost. Now this is the opposite of the cost argument we saw before. And one is that, hey, look, a proper facility, especially if you're talking towers and all that kind of stuff, is very expensive to build and expensive to maintain, especially compared to a lot of other sports. Dry land space, equipment, all that, very expensive, much more comparable to gymnastics in that realm compared to other sports like wrestling or volleyball, etc. And it's a very specific set of equipment and spaces that are needed, which means that the general public or the college community doesn't benefit from that. A pool can be used to teach academic classes, learn to swim for the community. It's got a lot of other benefits beyond that, whereas maybe a diving board or a trampoline or something like that doesn't. So as we move forward, then we got to consider some things with these rosters and where this looks right now, knowing all of that. So one of the things is going to be this new proposed roster limit where we're looking at 30 athletes for the Power 4 programs and potentially 22 for the SEC men. So if you break that down by the way events are distributed throughout competitions right now, you're going to see that, hey, obviously it's about 4-1 for where swimming represents over diving in the participation of those events. But if you break it down by those percentages, we should be having more athletes, 4 to 6 divers per team on a roster, and they should be getting more scholarship dollars than we are seeing allocated right now. Now, obviously, scholarships going to change moving forward into these P4 programs, but for the mid-majors and the other Division I programs, and then moving down to Division II and Division III, it's the same thing, right? You're going to have less scholarship dollars still, but that ratio is still not being met, and we're seeing that, and that's a lot because swim coaches are allocating, and they're going to choose to allocate what they feel helps them the most or where they want to put the most time and effort into. Okay. The other thing right now, as we move to these rosters and we talk about that replacement component of sports, is if we continue to keep the D1 requirement of 14 sports, so we're looking at 7 and 7 or 6 men and 8 women, with these new rosters, there's going to have to be some balancing that takes place. So what I did here is just kind of pulled together what we're looking at. We know the top 3 sports are going to stay: football, basketball, baseball for men, volleyball, basketball, softball for women. And you can see how many teams nationally in Division I compete in those. And then what I did for the women is I went and got the rest of the top 8 sports as far as representation in Division I, and then kind of built out what those roster numbers look like. Certainly when you are talking 105 football players, you've got a lot of numbers to make up. So right now, if you look at this chart, we're looking at, okay, well, there's 3 men's sports only. We would still have to come up with 3 men's sports, but they can only come up with about 50 athletes across those 3. So putting in track and field where there's 45 is going to be really problematic. So we almost need to look at what the smallest sports are that still have significant participation. And obviously there's going to be a lot of flex in this around the country. If you're Nebraska volleyball, you're not going to, consider that. Or gymnastics, right? Huge gymnastics schools out there, Nebraska, Utah, LSU. Those programs are going to stay, even though there's only about 60-some women's gymnastics programs in Division I. They are often big revenue makers for those institutions, and they bring a lot of traffic to campus. So I don't see that being a sport that is necessarily going to be dropped, even though across the country its participation level isn't as high. So when we move to the next thing and we say, okay, what kind of sports do we put in here to backfill for the men? Well, these are the most popular as far as programs existing with smallest rosters. So you're looking at adding men's golf, tennis, and cross country. And that's going to put you pretty comparable in those number of athletes for Title IX stuff. Now, there's a couple caveats in there, and that with cross country, if you are also doing track and field, those athletes are going to count 3 times because they're going to count for each of the sports, but there's still only one body existing that you maybe have to handle for insurance and meals and things like that, total scholarship. So having women's cross country with indoor and outdoor track and field, it brings your total number of bodies down by about 30 something from what your actual Title IX compliant number is. So if we're looking at something like this, you could see where, maybe a men's diving program with 8 could get added and you could still be there. But other than that, you're starting to get yourself out of compliance when you look at a roster that's going to be 20, 30 people even. So, I think that there's going to be lots of ongoing conversations still, but I want to be able to show how this could work or not work on both sides. When it comes down to it, at the end of the day, everyone is nervous. Every coach across the country, even in football, even in basketball, they are concerned about their jobs because of how the portal affects their ability to build a roster, etc. There is a lot going on, so everyone is nervous. And I think a lot of athletes are nervous too because they don't know if they're going to have a spot next year. Is that roster cut going to move them out? Are they going to have to find somewhere new to go? Are they going to have to give up on their sport? So everyone is nervous, and the future is unknown. Certainly we'll know a lot more come April, but based off of the things we are hearing right now, based on Department of Justice essentially intervening and saying, hey, when you do revenue sharing, it's going to have to be compliant with Title IX. That's going to change things. Possible NIL caps, sort of like a salary cap, and that will ultimately bring up a lawsuit that, we can get into another video and conversation about some of those changes. When you start limiting people's income or ability to earn. So I think a lot of this stuff is still in flux and is going to change and is going to continue to change. So when it comes down to it, change has to happen for Olympic sports in order to maintain their existence and their value. So whether that is coming up with new formats to make it more possible to generate revenue, whether that means coming up with a new way to raise funds to endow your program or something like that, all of this stuff is going to be up there. So everybody needs to take a big breath, try to work together and see what we can do to maintain the culture of developing young student athletes that coaches really got into it for in the first place, and not just get wiped out by essentially, paying football and basketball players, in the new revenue sharing stuff. So everybody hang in there, but keep talking. It is a really important thing to do. So good luck, and we will see you soon.